Hello. Today I wanted to take a look at class growth claret, which is Chateau Leoville Barton. So we're from Saint Julien on the Medoc. This is the 2011 vintage of that. And Leoville Barton is classified as a deuxième cru, a second growth. And I would suggest that Leoville Barton is one of the most consistent, classically styled, high quality class growth clarets available on the market today. It has a reputation for coming out during the Empereur campaign at a reasonable price, and as a result, compared to its peers, can often represent some really good value for money in the market. I guess also its consistency means that it does actually shine in lesser vintages, such as the 2011, making some really nice quality wines. But let's have a look at it and see what we make of it, shall we? So the Leoville estate, originally known as Montmuete, was planted in 1638 by somebody called Jean de Muete. He was a Bordeaux nobleman, and the vineyards that comprised that large estate stayed as one unit up until 1824. Now in 1821, an Anglo-Irish wine merchant, Hugh Barton, bought a property called Langoa, which he went on to rechristen Langoa Barton in Saint Julien. And soon after that, in 1824, he purchased some neighbouring portions of what was then the Leoville estate and renamed that estate Leoville Barton. So it has been in the hands of the same family for over 200 years now. A few years later, in 1840, the rest of the Leoville estate was portioned up and became Leoville Poifferet and Leoville Las Casses. Now, the Barton family had been involved in the Bordeaux wine trade since the 1720s. It was in 1722 that Thomas Barton moved to Bordeaux, and since 1745 he'd had a partnership in a négociant with somebody called Daniel Gustier, and Barton and Gustier are still quite an influential négociant company in Bordeaux. Now, as a result of the way it was split off from the rest of the estate, Leoville Barton has no chateau of its own. You see a chateau on the label, but actually that's Chateau Langoa Barton, which is where the wine is made. And ironically, Langoa Barton shows no chateau on its label whatsoever. But both wines are made at the Langoa estate. As I say, this is a deuxième Grand Cru Classe, so that's a classification that it gained in 1855, and actually it's one of very few chateaux that is still in the ownership of the same family that were the proprietors there when it was classified. Now, more recently in the estate's history, in 1983, both estates were inherited by Anthony Barton from his uncle Ronald Barton. And Anthony guided the two chateaux very successfully throughout that prosperous period for Bordeaux in the 80s, the 90s and through into the 21st century. Anthony passed back in 2022, and for the last 3 years the estate has been run by his daughter Lilian, who's aided in that by her children Melanie and Damien. So the estate has 51 hectares of vines, and they sit right at the heart of the Saint Julien appellation. The vineyards are divided into 3 main plots, and these sit on either side of the D2 road. In fact, as you drive through Saint Julien along the D2, you actually have to drive between the chateau and its gardens on one side of the road and the cellars, the Chai, on the other side, so you have to slow down there. And it's really quite a picturesque, old-fashioned setting. The third parcel of the vines is closer to the Gironde estuary with a clear view of the river, as is often the case for some of the best vineyards in both Saint Julien and Pauillac. These vineyards sit on beautiful hilltops of Garonne gravel, and as I say, they all face the Gironde. This is deep gravel, and beneath that there's a gravel and clay subsoil that acts as a water reservoir for the plants in years where there's a rainfall deficit. The vineyards are tended very traditionally. They'll plough between the rows instead of using herbicides or any other form of weeding. And they do say approximately 50% of the estate's vineyards are farmed organically. Now, I don't know if that was the case in 2011, but it's certainly the case now. The vineyards are mostly planted to Cabernet Sauvignon, which comprises 74% of plantings. There's a slightly increased proportion of Merlot, which now sits at about 23% of all plantings. And then the balance, the remaining 3%, is made up of Cabernet Franc, and that amount has decreased slightly. Now, average vine age here is 30 years, and that's actually quite important because it's the older vines whose roots have found their way right the way down through the deep gravel to the clay subsoils, giving them much better ability to deal with arid conditions. Having said average age is about 30 years, they do have some plots of the Merlot that are about 60 years of age. The vines are quite densely planted. They use a planting density of 9,000 vines per per hectare. Now 2011 was a generally poor vintage in comparison to the two preceding vintages, but compared to 2009 and 2010, most vintages will not stand up particularly well to that comparison. The weather, however, can be said to have been extremely inconsistent. Both the preceding winter and spring were dry, with the spring becoming really quite hot at times and giving an extremely early bud burst. Arid conditions continued into April and actually were quite worrying for producers. A warm May ensured that flowering was very successful. At the time, it was one of the earliest flowerings on record in Bordeaux. June, however, began quite cool, but then the temperatures flipped to the extent that by the end of the month, some of the developing Cabernet Sauvignon berries were actually damaged by sunburn. July brought much cooler weather, and actually in July and August there were some rains that gave the plants quite a bit of relief, but also added to the vignerons' worries in terms of the increased rot pressure. Temperatures fluctuated throughout August. There were intermittent patches of heat, and that led to summer storms, but at the same time that heat wasn't generally enough to provide the grapes with the ability to gain the concentration and richness of the preceding vintages. Now September did deliver a warm, dry finish to the season. It allowed an early harvest, but at the same time there was still the presence of disruptive storms. In fact, just before harvest there was a patch of really heavy hail that hit Saint-Estèphe slightly further to the north. So yes, the weather made harvest quite tricky and made meticulous sorting at grape reception essential. Given all the problems that occurred, the harvest was relatively small. However, it really was the fact that those producers with the resources and the determination to sort carefully, such as Leoville Barton, that made some of the best wines in this vintage. And these wines tend to have quite sort of rich red fruit character. They've got rich tannins, but tend to be slightly more acidic and have slightly lower alcohols than is normal. Consensus tends to be this is quite an attractive vintage, but probably best for short to mid-term drinking. Now for Leoville Barton, I said harvest was early. It went on here between the 12th and the 23rd of September. So harvest was complete a week before the end of September. That harvesting was done entirely by hand. The fruit was destemmed, and then at the winery, sorting went on by berry. I'm assuming that probably involved optical sorters as well as hand sorting. Once sorted, the berries were crushed and they were placed in large thermoregulated oak casks. Fermentation at Leoville Barton is done according to vineyard plot, and alcoholic fermentation will last from between 7 to 10 days. They're trying to be respectful with regard to extraction there, so they're monitoring the extraction and they'll cut down the number of pump overs they're doing according to the progress of the must to make sure they're not over extracting. Post-fermentation maceration lasted about 3 weeks, and then the wine was run off into barrel. And at this stage, the wine was kept in its individual batches, which related to those plots it had been picked from in the vineyard. The wine aged for between 16 and 18 months in French oak barriques, so 225 litre barrels. Of those, 60% were new. So presumably the remainder were second fill barrels. And they make it very clear that aging went on in a temperature controlled cellar at 15 degrees C. The final blend for Leoville Barton in 2011 was 80% Cabernet Sauvignon, 15% of Merlot and 5% of Cabernet Franc. And this is a wine where I've seen a drinking window suggested as running between 2019 and 2040. So I would hope that by now it's drinking more or less at its peak. So let's take a look at it, shall we? Looking at the colour, it's a medium to deep ruby red. It's not quite opaque, I can see through it. There is a slight lightening and sort of an oranginess at the rim there, but it doesn't look old or tired. It's not particularly browning. Swirling the wine, it's quite readily producing tears that are flowing down the side of the glass there. And the wine is labelled as having 13% alcohol, so that's not just alcohol, that's tannins creating that viscosity. So let's see what we think of the aromas, shall we? The aromas have a richness, a ripeness and a warmth, and yet at the same time there's a classic restrained note to them as well. They are very much on the red fruit end of the spectrum. While there are perhaps touches of cassis, there's much more red currant, cranberry, possibly even more sort of a ripe plum note. But sitting behind that, framing it almost, there are notes of really quite well integrated cedar, and that's coming through as some relatively high-taste sweet spice notes such as cinnamon and nutmeg. And given the wine's concentration, it's almost a licoricey sort of density to the aromas as well. So let's have a taste. The wine's structured, it's medium bodied. It's that very classic cedary structure, very fine, slightly grainy tannins, but not standing out, really quite nicely integrated with rich, plummy, cranberry, maybe a touch of ripe red cherry, and really sort of juicy, fresh, red currant fruit coming through there. And the acidity's helping to make sure that it really is a lovely, long, fresh, juicy presence of that sort of red currant and cranberry note right through to the finish. The tannins are providing some quite good grip. There's a little bit of mouth-watering bitterness, perhaps a tiny touch of sort of coffee notes, but really any bitterness is being overwhelmed by quite a good density of really quite sort of plummy and dried cranberry red fruit. I talked about the long-lasting juicy red fruit notes on the finish, but there's also some quite good structure with the tannins introducing a sort of a longer lasting licoricey note that's enduring very well as well. The alcohol is nicely in balance, and although the acidity is fresh, it's not standing out and making the finish seem thin or lean. So yes, I think this is a wine that's providing some really quite nice drinking now. I don't think there's a need to keep it any longer to see if it will improve. I think it is probably pretty much at its optimum. At the same time, I don't think there's any rush to drink it up either. The suggestion from the drinking window I've seen is that this is a wine that should keep for another 15 years. Certainly it has plenty of vibrancy and density. I think that it should probably have at least 10 and probably 15 years ahead of it. I looked at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for the wine, and this comes in at 92 out of 100. And I think that's a completely creditable score, and I think it is at about the right place. While it has a good concentration of fruit, it has this classical structure and a wonderful length. It doesn't quite have the concentrated black cherry and lively cassis fruit that you'd expect from a top Leoville Barton or any other top wine from Saint Julien. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you're watching these tastings and you're enjoying them and you haven't yet subscribed, it'd be fantastic if you consider doing that. I'd really appreciate your support in that way. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement. And if you have any comments, please pop them in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I'll leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's available in your market and at what price. And also there's a lot more background information about the wine, its region, its availability and its pricing history, all on those pages there. So thank you once again for joining me, and I do hope that maybe at some stage in the near future you'll make some more time and come and join me for another video tasting. Until then, bye for now.